In the horror story from a night shift nurse. The fluorescent lights in the staff lounge of St. Augustine Memorial Hospital flickered with their usual tired rhythm as Sarah Chen poured her third cup of coffee. It was 2:47 a.m. on a Thursday in late October, and the pediatric wing hummed with the kind of hollow silence that made every small sound seem amplified. She'd been working night shifts for 6 years now, ever since her divorce, and thought she'd seen everything the darkness could offer. She was wrong. The hospital sat on the outskirts of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, a rust-belt town where the steel mill had closed 20 years ago and taken most of the hope with it. The building itself was a relic from the 1960s, all cinder blocks and narrow hallways, perpetually understaffed and overworked. Sarah had chosen pediatrics because she thought caring for children would be easier than watching the elderly fade away. Tonight, she would question that decision. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring you more stories like this one. She checked her watch and headed back to the nurse's station, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking against the yellowed linoleum. Room 407 had been quiet all night, which was unusual. The boy in that room, Marcus Webb, had been admitted 3 days ago with what the doctors initially thought was severe pneumonia. But his condition had only worsened, and the tests kept coming back inconclusive. He was 8 years old, thin as a rail, with dark circles under his eyes that seemed too old for his face. Sarah pulled his chart and frowned. His temperature had spiked again, 103, 4 degrees. She grabbed the medication cart and made her way down the dimly lit corridor, past the hand-painted murals of cartoon animals that were supposed to make the place feel cheerful, but only succeeded in looking eerie at night. The door to 407 stood slightly ajar. Sarah paused, her hand on the handle. She could hear something, a low, rhythmic sound, almost like humming. Pushing the door open, she found Marcus sitting upright in bed, his back rigid against the pillows. His eyes were open but unfocused, staring at the far corner of the room where shadows pooled despite the nightlight's glow. "Marcus!" Sarah kept her voice soft and approached the bed. "Honey, you should be sleeping." The boy didn't respond. The humming continued, and Sarah realized with a chill that it wasn't coming from Marcus. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, a sound that vibrated in her chest and made her teeth ache. She checked his vitals. Pulse elevated, pupils dilated. "Marcus, can you hear me?" His lips moved, forming words she couldn't quite catch. Sarah leaned closer. "She wants to come home," Marcus whispered. "She's been waiting so long." "Who's been waiting, sweetheart?" "The lady in the walls." Sarah felt the hair on her arms stand up. She'd heard patients say strange things before, fever dreams, medication side effects, the confusion that came with illness. But something about Marcus's tone, flat and certain, made this different. "There's no lady in the walls," Sarah said, injecting false confidence into her voice. "You're having a bad dream. Let me give you something to help you sleep." Marcus's head turned toward her with mechanical precision. His eyes, when they focused on her face, seemed wrong somehow, too knowing, too ancient for a child's gaze. "You hear her too," he said. "At night, when you walk these halls, you hear her crying." Sarah's hands trembled as she prepared the medication. He was right. For weeks now, she'd heard sounds she couldn't explain, soft weeping echoing through empty corridors, the rustle of fabric when no one was there. She'd convinced herself it was the building settling, pipes groaning, her imagination working overtime during the lonely hours. But hearing Marcus speak it aloud shattered that comfortable denial. She administered the medication and adjusted his IV drip. "Try to rest now. I'll be right outside if you need anything." As she turned to leave, Marcus spoke again. "She died here. Room 407. They covered it up, buried her in the walls so no one would know." Sarah's blood ran cold. She hurried from the room and returned to the nurse's station, where Janet Kowalski, the other night nurse, was filling out paperwork. "Janet, has Marcus said anything strange to you?" The older woman looked up, her reading glasses perched on her nose. Strange how. Kid's been pretty out of it since he got here. He keeps talking about someone dying in room 407. A woman buried in the walls. Janet's expression shifted, a shadow passing across her weathered face. She set down her pen slowly. You don't know the story? What story? Janet glanced down the hallway, as if checking to make sure they were alone. Before your time. Before mine even. Back in the 80s. There was a nurse who worked this floor, Jennifer Hartley. Young thing, just out of school. She disappeared one night during her shift. Disappeared? Vanished. Middle of her rounds. Her car was still in the parking lot, her purse in her locker. Police investigated, suspected foul play, but they never found a body. Eventually, the case went cold. Janet lowered her voice. Some of the older staff used to say they'd see her. A figure in a nurse's uniform, walking the halls, always near room 407. Sarah felt her mouth go dry. Why that room specifically? That's where they found her belongings, her clipboard, her medication cart, both abandoned outside the door, like she'd just stepped inside and never came back out. The lights flickered again, and both women looked up instinctively. In the sudden dimness, Sarah thought she saw movement at the end of the hallway, a pale shape that vanished when the lights stabilized. I need some air, Sarah muttered, heading for the staff exit. She pushed through the heavy door and stepped into the parking lot where October wind cut through her scrubs. The hospital loomed behind her, a concrete monolith with scattered lit windows that looked like watchful eyes. She pulled out her phone and did something she hadn't done in months. She called her ex-husband, David. He was a contractor, someone who understood buildings and their secrets. It rang 4 times before his groggy voice answered. Sarah, it's 3 a.m. I need to ask you something. When they renovate old buildings, is it possible for something to be hidden in the walls? Like permanently? A long pause. What's going on? Just answer the question. She heard him shift, probably sitting up in bed. Yeah, it's possible, especially in older construction. If someone wanted to hide something during a renovation, seal it up behind drywall or concrete, it could stay there for decades. Why? Sarah's mind raced. St. Augustine had undergone major renovations in 1986, right after Jennifer Hartley's disappearance. She remembered hearing about it from hospital administrators. They'd upgraded the pediatric wing, reconfigured rooms, installed new ventilation systems. Sarah, what's happening? I have to go. She ended the call and turned back toward the building. Room 407 had been one of the rooms renovated during that construction. If someone had wanted to hide evidence, to make a body disappear in plain sight. She re-entered the hospital and made her way back to the pediatric wing. Janet was on the phone at the nurses' station, speaking in low, urgent tones. She hung up quickly when Sarah approached. Everything okay? Sarah asked. Marcus's fever spiked again. Dr. Reeves is coming in. Janet wouldn't meet her eyes. Sarah, maybe you should take your break. I can handle things here. I'm fine. I'm serious. You look pale. Before Sarah could respond, an alarm blared from room 407. Both nurses sprinted down the hallway. Inside, Marcus was seizing, his small body convulsing against the restraints they'd placed earlier. Sarah grabbed the emergency medication while Janet tried to stabilize him. Code Blue, pediatric wing, room 407, Janet shouted into the intercom. The crash team arrived within minutes. Dr. Reeves, 2 residents, a respiratory therapist. They worked with practiced efficiency, but Sarah noticed something that made her stomach twist. As they moved Marcus, trying to control the seizure, she saw marks on his arms, not from the IV or restraints. These were bruises, forming in the shape of fingerprints, adult-sized fingerprints. Doctor, she started to say, but the words died in her throat. Because in the chaos of the medical emergency, in the harsh fluorescent light, with a dozen people crowding the small room, she saw her. A woman in an outdated nurse's uniform stood in the corner, watching. Her face was grey, her eyes hollow, and her mouth moved silently as if trying to speak. Sarah blinked, and the figure was gone. The seizure finally subsided. Marcus lay still, breathing shallow but steady. Dr. Reeves ordered a full neuro workup and additional tests. As the team dispersed, Sarah stayed behind, staring at the corner where she'd seen the apparition. "There's something wrong with this room," she said to no one in particular. Dr. Reeves, a tired man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair, paused at the door. "What do you mean?" "I mean something happened here. Something that was never resolved." He studied her with the weary patience of someone who'd worked too many night shifts. "Sarah, you've been here 6 years. You know how it is. Night shift plays tricks on your mind. Get some rest." After he left, Sarah stood alone in the room with the unconscious child. The humming had returned, that low vibration that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. She pressed her hand against the plaster and felt it, a coldness that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning, a chill that seeped into her bones. "Jennifer," she whispered. The lights went out. In the sudden darkness, illuminated only by the glow of medical equipment, Sarah heard it clearly. Footsteps, not in the hallway, but inside the wall. Slow, deliberate steps, as if someone were walking through a space that shouldn't exist. Then came the scratching, fingernails dragging against plaster from the inside. Sarah fumbled for her phone, turned on its flashlight. The beam shook as she swept it across the room. The sound continued, moving along the wall toward the corner. She followed it with the light until she reached a section of wall that looked slightly different from the rest. The paint was newer, the texture not quite matching the surrounding plaster. She ran from the room, her heart hammering. Janet looked up from the nurse's station with alarm. "Call maintenance," Sarah demanded. "Tell them we need someone to check the walls in room 407, now." "At 3 in the morning? For what?" "Just do it." Janet must have heard something in Sarah's voice that brooked no argument. She made the call. 20 minutes later, Pete Garrison, the night maintenance supervisor, arrived with his toolkit. He was a burly man in his 60s who'd worked at St. Augustine since before Sarah was born. "What's the problem?" he asked, clearly annoyed at being called from whatever he'd been doing. Sarah led him to room 407, where Marcus still lay unconscious. "That wall. There's something wrong with it." Pete examined the section Sarah had indicated. He knocked on it, listening to the hollow sound. "This is from the 86 renovation. They closed off part of the old ventilation system, sealed it up behind new drywall." He frowned. "Though I gotta say, it doesn't sound quite right. Can you open it? Now, with a patient in here?" He sedated. "Please." Something in her expression must have convinced him. Pete retrieved his tools and began carefully cutting away the drywall. The sound of the oscillating saw filled the room, drowning out the humming that Sarah could still feel in her chest. As Pete pulled away the first section of plaster, a smell emerged. Musty, organic, wrong. "Jesus," Pete muttered, stepping back. Sarah approached, holding her breath. Behind the wall was indeed an old ventilation space, but it had been sealed off incorrectly, and in that dark, confined space, illuminated by Pete's worklight, she saw it. Fabric. Old, discolored fabric. And beneath it, the unmistakable outline of human bones. Pete's hands shook as he set down his tools. "We need to call the police. Right now." The next hours passed in a blur. Officers arrived, then detectives, then the medical examiner. Room 407 was sealed off as a crime scene. Marcus was moved to another room, still unconscious, but stable. Sarah gave her statement 3 times, trying to explain what had led her to that wall, knowing how insane it sounded. By the time dawn broke, the entire hospital was buzzing with the news. The remains had been there for decades, hidden during the renovation. Dental records would eventually confirm what everyone already suspected. Jennifer Hartley had never left St. Augustine Memorial Hospital. She'd been killed here, her body concealed in the walls, her disappearance written off as a cold case. Sarah sat in the staff lounge as the morning shift arrived, unable to process what had happened. Detective Morrison, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, sat across from her with a cup of coffee. The medical examiner's preliminary report suggests she was struck from behind, single blow to the head, quick, probably painless. Morrison studied Sarah. "You want to tell me again how you knew to look there?" Sarah met her gaze. "A patient told me. Marcus Webb. He said someone died in that room, that she was buried in the walls. An 8-year-old boy with a fever. I know how it sounds." Morrison sipped her coffee. "Actually, you'd be surprised what I believe. I've been doing this job for 20 years. I've learned not to dismiss anything outright." She pulled out a photograph. "This is Jennifer Hartley, 23 years old when she disappeared." Sarah looked at the picture. The woman was young, smiling, full of life, nothing like the grey figure she'd seen in the corner of room 407. Yet the uniform was the same, and the eyes held the same sadness. "Do you have any idea who killed her?" Sarah asked. "We're looking into it. The good news is that whoever did this probably thought they'd gotten away with it. People get complacent after 40 years. They talk, they make mistakes." Morrison leaned forward. "But here's what bothers me. The wall where we found her, that wasn't sealed during the general renovation. According to the maintenance logs, that particular section was done separately by a private contractor. No record of who. Someone with access to the hospital, someone who knew the renovation schedule." "Exactly. We're pulling employment records from 1985 and 86. Anyone who worked here during that time, especially maintenance, construction, or administration." Morrison stood. "Get some rest, Ms. Chen. We'll be in touch." After the detective left, Sarah remained in the lounge, watching through the window as crime scene technicians carried evidence bags from the building. She thought about Jennifer Hartley, dying alone in a hospital corridor, her body hidden by someone who'd betrayed the trust that came with working in a place meant to heal. Janet entered the lounge, looking as exhausted as Sarah felt. "I can't believe it. All these years, she was right there. Did you ever work with anyone who might have known her? Most of the old staff are retired or dead now." Janet poured herself coffee with shaking hands. "There's one person, though, Dr. Raymond Carlyle. He was chief of staff back then before he retired in the 90s. He still lives in town, up on Maple Hill." Sarah pulled out her phone. "I need his address." "Sarah, the police are handling it. I need to understand, why hide her body here? Why not just dump it somewhere?" "Because it was someone who worked here," Janet said quietly. "Someone who needed her to simply disappear. Making her body vanish made it look like she'd run away, started a new life somewhere else. Finding a corpse would have meant a real investigation, evidence, forensics." She set down her cup. "Whoever did this was smart, clinical. They almost got away with it." Sarah left the hospital as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the parking lot. She was supposed to sleep, supposed to let the professionals handle the investigation. Instead, she found herself driving through Millbrook's quiet streets, past the closed storefronts and empty factories, toward Maple Hill, where the town's remaining wealth lived in Victorian houses with wraparound porches. Dr. Raymond Carlyle's home was a grand affair, though clearly aging like its owner. The paint peeled in places, and the garden showed signs of neglect. Sarah rang the doorbell and waited, suddenly uncertain what she would say. The man who answered was tall and thin, probably in his 80s, with white hair and rheumy eyes behind thick glasses. He looked at Sarah with confusion, tinged with suspicion. "Can I help you?" "Dr. Carlyle. My name is Sarah Chen. I'm a nurse at St. Augustine Memorial. I was hoping I could ask you some questions about something that happened a long time ago." His expression hardened. "If this is about Jennifer Hartley, the police have already called. I have nothing to say." He started to close the door, but Sarah put her hand against it. "Please, a child is sick. He's been having visions, saying things he couldn't possibly know. I need to understand what happened to Jennifer." Dr. Carlyle stared at her for a long moment, then stepped aside. "Come in." The interior of the house was dim, filled with old furniture, and the musty smell of a life lived alone. He led her to a study lined with medical textbooks and photographs from his career. He gestured to a chair and sat heavily in another. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. Why she was killed, why no one found her." He was silent for so long, Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he spoke. "Jennifer was a good nurse, dedicated, compassionate, but she saw something she shouldn't have." Sarah leaned forward. "What did she see?" "The hospital was in financial trouble back then. Desperately so. We were on the verge of closing. The administrator at the time, Gerald Thorne, was creative in his solutions. He was diverting funds, falsifying records, billing for procedures that were never performed. It was fraud on a massive scale. And Jennifer discovered this?" Dr. Carlyle nodded slowly. "She came to me with her concerns. She'd noticed discrepancies in patient charts, medications being documented but never administered. She wanted to report it to the State Health Board." He removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "I told her to wait, to let me handle it internally. I was trying to protect the hospital, you understand. If the fraud came to light, we would have closed. Hundreds of people would have lost their jobs, and the community would have lost its only hospital. But she didn't wait. She went to Thorne directly, confronted him." His voice cracked. "That night, she disappeared. Thorne claimed she never showed up for her shift. When the investigation started, I corroborated his story. I said she'd seemed troubled, that I'd been concerned about her mental state." Sarah felt sick. "You helped cover it up." "I didn't know." The old man's hands trembled. "I swear I didn't know what Thorne had done. I thought Jennifer had run away, too frightened to follow through with her accusations. It wasn't until years later, after Thorne died, that I found his journal. He'd kept meticulous records of everything, including what he'd done to Jennifer." Dr. Carlyle pulled open a desk drawer and removed a leather-bound book. "He killed her in the hospital corridor. Panicked. Hit her with a fire extinguisher. Then he called in a friend who did private construction work. They hid her body during the renovation, made it look like part of the planned construction." Sarah took the journal with shaking hands. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, detailing years of fraud, and in one terrible entry, the night Jennifer Hartley died. "Why didn't you come forward when you found this?" "By then, Thorne was dead. Suicide. And I was a coward." He looked at her with red-rimmed eyes. "I've lived with that guilt for 30 years. Every day I remember that I could have prevented her death if I'd had the courage to act. Instead, I protected a corrupt institution and let a killer go free." Sarah stood, clutching the journal. "I have to give this to the police. I know, I've been expecting this for a long time." He smiled sadly. "Perhaps now Jennifer can finally rest." Sarah returned to the hospital that evening for her shift, though she'd barely slept. The journal was now in police custody, and Dr. Carlyle was being questioned as an accessory after the fact. The local news was buzzing with the story. The nurse who'd been hidden in the walls for 40 years, the conspiracy that had concealed her murder. But Sarah's concern was Marcus Webb. He'd woken that afternoon, his fever finally breaking. When she entered his new room, 309, far from where Jennifer's body had been found, he looked small and fragile, but alert. "Hi, Marcus. How are you feeling?" "Better." His voice was hoarse from days of intubation. "She's gone now, isn't she?" Sarah sat on the edge of his bed. "Who's gone, sweetheart?" "The sad lady. She was stuck, couldn't leave until someone found her." He looked at Sarah with those two old eyes. "She showed me things. I saw what happened to her. It wasn't fair." "No, it wasn't fair at all. But now she can go home. She told me to thank you." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. She'd never believed in ghosts, in spirits trapped between worlds. She still wasn't sure she did. But something had happened in room 407, something that had led her to uncover a decades-old murder. Whether it was the fevered visions of a sick child, her own subconscious picking up on environmental clues, or something more otherworldly, Jennifer Hartley had finally been heard. Over the following weeks, the investigation expanded. Detective Morrison uncovered more of Thorne's corruption. Patients had been harmed by his cost-cutting measures. Families had paid for treatments their loved ones never received. The hospital administration issued formal apologies and established a memorial fund in Jennifer's name. Her family, who'd spent 40 years wondering what had happened to their daughter, finally had closure and a place to grieve. Marcus made a full recovery. The doctors never could explain what had caused his illness or his sudden improvement. Sarah suspected they never would. Some things defied medical explanation. On the night before Jennifer's remains were released to her family for burial, Sarah returned to the renovated room 407. It had been thoroughly cleaned and repainted, all traces of the crime scene removed. Yet she felt compelled to visit, to stand in the space where a young woman had drawn her last breath. The room was empty now, waiting for its next patient. Sarah stood in the center and closed her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry no one listened when you tried to speak up. I'm sorry it took so long to find you." The hospital's night sounds surrounded her. Distant beeping, the hum of ventilation, footsteps in the corridor. Normal sounds. The humming in the walls was gone, and the air no longer carried that bone-deep chill. Sarah opened her eyes. For just a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing in the corner. Not the grey, tormented spirit from before, but a young woman in a nurse's uniform, smiling with relief and gratitude. Then the image faded, leaving only shadows and fluorescent light. Janet found her there a few minutes later. "You okay?" "Yeah, I think so." Sarah took one last look around the room. "I think we all are now." As they walked back to the nurses' station together, Sarah reflected on what she'd learned. Evil existed in the world, not supernatural evil, but the human kind. The evil of greed, of cowardice, of choosing money and reputation over a young woman's life. But there was also resilience, the determination of truth to eventually surface no matter how deeply buried. The night shift continued as it always did. Medications were administered, charts were updated, patients rested or struggled or healed. Sarah made her rounds with a new awareness, seeing the hospital not just as a building, but as a repository of countless human stories, some joyful, some tragic, all deserving to be remembered. In the weeks that followed, St. Augustine Memorial Hospital underwent changes beyond the physical renovation of room 407. The board of directors implemented new oversight procedures, whistleblower protections, and regular audits. Jennifer Hartley's photograph was hung in the staff lounge with a plaque that read, "In memory of a nurse who had the courage to speak truth. May we honor her by doing the same." Sarah continued working the night shift, though she no longer felt alone in those quiet hours. She discovered that the dead sometimes had important things to say, and the living had a responsibility to listen. Every time she walked past room 407, she thought of Jennifer and the price she'd paid for trying to do the right thing. Marcus Webb was discharged 2 weeks after the discovery. His parents, overwhelmed with gratitude that their son had recovered, never quite understood his role in uncovering the truth. Sarah didn't try to explain. Some mysteries were better left to those who'd experienced them. On the night of Jennifer's funeral, which Sarah attended along with a surprising number of hospital staff, both current and retired, she drove back to St. Augustine for her shift. The autumn air was crisp and the sky was clear, filled with more stars than she usually noticed in the light-polluted sky above Millbrook. As she entered the hospital, she paused in the lobby, looking at the directory that listed all the departments, all the people who worked here, trying to heal and comfort and save lives. Somewhere in this building, Jennifer Hartley had started her career with the same idealism, the same hope of making a difference. "Rest in peace," Sarah whispered. She rode the elevator to the pediatric floor and began her shift. Room 407 had a new patient now, a little girl recovering from appendicitis. Sarah checked on her, adjusted her IV, and smiled at her sleepy greeting. The room felt normal, peaceful. Whatever had lingered there was finally gone. Over the following months, As winter settled over Pennsylvania and the hospital prepared for the holiday season, Sarah noticed subtle changes in herself. She was more assertive with doctors who cut corners, more willing to question procedures that seemed wrong, more determined to be a voice for patients who couldn't speak for themselves. Jennifer's story had taught her that silence could be its own form of violence, that bearing witness was sometimes the most important thing you could do. The night shifts no longer felt like lonely vigils, but rather a kind of sacred watch, a time when the barriers between worlds grew thin and truth had a chance to surface. Sarah had learned to listen not just to what patients said, but to what the building itself seemed to communicate through its groans and whispers and occasional unexplained phenomena. Not that she talked about such things with her colleagues. She'd learned that some experiences defied explanation, and trying to rationalize them only diminished their power. Instead, she carried the knowledge privately, a secret understanding that the world was stranger and more connected than most people realized. One night in late December, as snow fell softly outside and the hospital settled into its winter rhythm, Sarah received a package at the nurse's station. It was from Jennifer Hartley's mother, a woman now in her 70s, who'd attended the funeral with dignity despite her obvious grief. Inside was a photograph of Jennifer at her nursing school graduation, young and radiant with her whole life ahead of her. Attached was a note in shaky handwriting. "Dear Sarah, thank you for giving my daughter a voice when she could no longer speak for herself. Thank you for having the courage that others lacked." Jennifer always believed that nursing was about bearing witness to human suffering and doing everything in your power to alleviate it. You honored that calling. With gratitude and love, Margaret Hartley. Sarah placed the photograph on the bulletin board in the staff lounge next to the memorial plaque. She stood back and looked at Jennifer's smile, seeing not a ghost or a victim, but a woman who'd tried to do the right thing and paid the ultimate price. "I'll keep listening," Sarah promised, "for all the voices that need to be heard." As she returned to her rounds, the hospital seemed to settle around her with something like contentment. The fluorescent lights burned steady, the equipment hummed its normal rhythms, and the night stretched ahead with its usual mixture of routine and unpredictability. Sarah Chen walked the corridors of St. Augustine Memorial Hospital with new purpose, knowing that sometimes the most important discoveries happened not in daylight, but in darkness. Not through science, but through paying attention to what others dismissed as impossible. She'd learned that the dead could speak if the living were brave enough to listen, and that truth, no matter how deeply buried, would eventually find its way to light. The horror story of Jennifer Hartley wasn't about supernatural evil, but about human failings. Greed, cowardice, the willingness to sacrifice one person to protect an institution. But it was also a story about redemption, about justice delayed but not denied, about the power of bearing witness. As Sarah completed her rounds that snowy December night, checking on sleeping children and adjusting medications and writing notes in charts, she felt Jennifer's presence not as a haunting, but as a reminder. In a profession that could become routine, that could numb you to suffering through sheer repetition, Jennifer's story called her back to the fundamental truth of nursing. Every life matters, every voice deserves to be heard, and silence in the face of wrong is its own kind of betrayal. The night shift continued, and Sarah worked through it with renewed dedication, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, Jennifer Hartley was finally at peace. And in room 407, where a little girl slept peacefully, recovering from surgery, there were no more shadows in the corners, no more cold spots or unexplained sounds, just a normal hospital room where healing happened, where life continued, where the past had finally been laid to rest. But Sarah would never forget. None of them would. And perhaps that was the real ending. Not a supernatural resolution, but a human one. The understanding that remembering the dead and honoring their struggles was how we prevented history from repeating itself. As dawn approached and the day shift began to arrive, Sarah finished her documentation and prepared to go home. She took one last walk through the pediatric wing, past room 407, past the memorial photograph in the staff lounge, past all the rooms where children slept or woke or fought their own battles against illness and pain. Outside, the snow had stopped and the sky was beginning to lighten. Sarah stepped into the cold morning air, exhausted but satisfied with the night's work. Behind her, St. Augustine Memorial Hospital stood solid and stolid, its windows reflecting the rising sun. A place where terrible things had happened, but where healing continued, day after day, shift after shift. She climbed into her car and drove through the quiet streets of Millbrook, past the shuttered steel mill and the empty factories, past the Victorian houses on Maple Hill where Dr. Carlyle lived with his guilt, past all the ordinary places where extraordinary human dramas played out unseen. Home was a small apartment that still felt empty, even after 6 years of living alone, but Sarah didn't mind. She'd learned that loneliness and solitude were different things, that you could be alone without being isolated, that purpose could fill spaces that people once occupied. She made herself tea, sat by the window, and watched the town wake up. Somewhere, Jennifer Hartley's family was preparing for their first Christmas, knowing what had happened to their daughter. It wouldn't ease their grief, but it would give them closure, a place to direct their mourning, an ending to the story even if it wasn't the one they'd hoped for. And in St. Augustine Memorial Hospital, nurses like Janet and doctors like Reeves would continue their work, maybe thinking occasionally about the young woman who died trying to do the right thing, maybe wondering if they'd have had the same courage, maybe resolving to speak up when they saw something wrong. That was Jennifer's legacy, not the horror of her death, but the reminder of why nursing mattered, why speaking truth to power was essential, why every voice deserved to be heard. Sarah carried that lesson with her now, woven into her understanding of what it meant to care for others, to work in a place where life and death intersected every day, to bear witness to human suffering and human resilience. As the sun climbed higher and the town settled into its daily rhythms, Sarah finally allowed herself to sleep. She dreamed of corridors and fluorescent lights, of children recovering and families reunited, of a young nurse who'd found her voice again after 40 years of silence. When she woke that evening to prepare for another shift, the dream had faded, but its essence remained. She showered, dressed in her scrubs, and drove back to the hospital as darkness fell once more over Millbrook. The night shift beckoned, full of unknown challenges and quiet moments, of suffering to be eased and healing to be facilitated. Sarah Chen walked through the hospital doors with purpose, ready to listen, ready to bear witness, ready to honor Jennifer Hartley's memory by doing the work they'd both chosen, caring for the vulnerable, speaking for those who couldn't speak for themselves, and refusing to look away when confronted with injustice. The fluorescent lights flickered their usual greeting. The corridors stretched ahead with their familiar geometry, and in room 407, a little girl slept peacefully, unaware of the history that had unfolded in that space, protected now by nurses who understood that their most important duty wasn't administering medication or checking vitals, but bearing witness to the human stories that played out in every room, on every shift, in every quiet moment when truth demanded to be heard.